Well, this morning we're going to begin the Song of Solomon, if you want to make your way there. And so the first verse of the first chapter reads like this: the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Now, Song of Solomon is, because as the first verse shares with us, also known as the Song of Songs. It was, this book we have, a poem that was sung. Now, Solomon was a fairly prolific songwriter. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32 tells us that Solomon wrote 1,005 songs, and this was essentially his greatest hit. If George Strait is the king of country, he is the king of all Israel songwriting, literally, poetically, and musically. Song of Solomon. Now, as we think about the introduction to this particular book, let me share with you that Song of Solomon is very controversial. And it's controversial for two main reasons: because of its intent and because of its content. Its intent is this: to express love. It is a love poem. And by love, I mean racy, erotic, descriptive. Its two main themes are intense desire and physical attraction. And what it desires is to be, for those who read it, this is the impression we get from the poem, this intense desire to be known fully and yet still truly loved. To be fully known and to be truly loved. Now, Hebrew poetry is different than the kind of poetry that we may be used to in elementary form in America. There's no rhyme, such as, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. Hebrew poetry does have rhyme and meter, but it's based upon repetition of ideas and different forms of parallelism, building upon an idea, contrasting an idea, or extrapolating on an idea. And yet, interestingly enough, this particular love poem is also, for those handful of you that love Hebrew poetry, you'll like to know that it's also a garden poem. It's garden poetry. And so when we think about how they express their love towards one another, you might, like me, know that it probably wouldn't work to go home and tell your spouse, your freshly brushed teeth are like a well-shorn shock of sheep coming down off the mountains of Hermon. I'd be like, what? But it's garden poetry. And so in the poetry, as we read it, there are sheep, and there are gazelles, and there are deer, and there's lilies, and there's pomegranates, and there's all of these different types of fruit, honeycomb. And so we're in a garden. Now, it's important that you understand why this is such. It's a love poem. It's a garden poem, because I think maybe in its greatest intent, Song of Solomon is supposed to hearken us back to the Garden of Eden, where there were animals and fruit, and there was beauty and love untainted. And then probably, if that's the beginning of the parameter, all the way then to the very end of the Bible, to the last of Revelation, where once again, in eternity, there is a garden. And everything is in this garden-like setting. And there's beauty and there's love untainted with the Father, with the Son, with the Holy Ghost. And so its intent is to portray to us in the most striking terms available, untainted love. Now, it's also controversial because of its content. It has been viewed in three ways historically. The first way is people take it as just what it is, a Hebrew love story. And so the three main players in this particular poem are the Shulamite girl, this young, dark shepherdess, who is wooed then by a shepherd and ostensibly a third party, the king. And some people see this as a love triad, the shepherd and the king. They're both vying for the attention of this beautiful young Shulamite girl. But then others have said, well, I think it is definitely the Shulamite girl, obviously the one that's being wooed, but the shepherd and the king, they are the same person. That's where I would fall if I was going to interpret this poem. Secondly, past just what it is, a Hebrew love poem, the rabbis in Israel taught and still do teach that this poem is a picture of God's love for Israel, where God is the shepherd king, Israel is the beautiful young Shulamite girl, and the love that they have for one another is the covenant that God made for Israel. And yet, interesting, that's what they believe the content is, yet because of the intent, in ancient days, Hebrew young men were not allowed to read the Song of Solomon until they were 30. Get them all revved up. The third way that this has been interpreted has begun obviously in the church age, where the readers of the New Testament would say, looking back at the Old, finding the Old Testament revealed in the New, hey, guess what? Christ's love for the church is what's being portrayed here, past it just being a Hebrew love story. That Christ is the shepherd king, and we are the church, and we live in this New Testament grace age. That what binds us is the grace and the love and the Spirit of Christ. So as we look at this, how we'll approach it is, we'll read it as just what it is, a Hebrew love story, but then we'll also look at it as Christ's love for the church. We'll see it as a picture of that, and hopefully we'll gain some understanding into what Christ would want us to know of Him and what He would desire how we should respond to Him.